people in China becoming richer, so therefore we are losers. And a lot of people in the West, they don't know anything about Asia, or Africa, or South America. My definition of success is when everyone else thinks that you have made it, but you just think you're getting started.
Hello guys, and welcome to YanaTV. Today with us we have Fredrik Härén. And Fredrik is the global conference speaker and author of 9 books, where The Developing World is one of them. And that's the book particularly we would like to talk about today. So Fredrik, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Why did you decide to write this book?
You need to understand that I used to write books about creativity. Mm-hmm. And I'm from Sweden. I used to live in Sweden. And then suddenly in 2005, the Chinese leader Hu Jintao held a speech to the Chinese people where he said, China is now going to become an innovative country. So as an author of creativity books, if the largest country in the world suddenly says, which is not famous at all for creativity, suddenly says, now we're going to innovate, I felt like, okay, I need to be there. But I went there with the idea that I was going to help them. Like, I need to teach them creativity. So I moved to China, translated my book to Chinese, and went there with the ambition to teach creativity to the Chinese. But when only after a few months, I started to realize that it's not that the Chinese weren't creative. Of course, I knew this deep inside, but they didn't know Western creativity, but they had something else. And what I realized that they had a different kind of creativity. And I got very, very curious around how is creativity different from in China versus Europe. And then I expanded this to how is creativity different in developing countries versus developed countries. Because during the work with this book, I went, I think, to 18 different developing countries. So yeah. I lived in China, but I went Indonesia, South Africa, Turkey.
Yeah, many of them are mentioned also here.
All over the place, because I wanted to see, and I found some similarities. Of course, there are many differences, but I found some similarities between people living in developing countries and then some similarities between people living in developed countries. And the thing is, usually the trick with this book is usually we say developing country is a bad thing and developed country is a good thing. But what I did is I turned it around. So I said, it's like there are actually advantages with living in a developing country, and there are disadvantages living in a developed country. And we always talk about the other two. So I said, well, yes, there is corruption, there's bad infrastructure, there's all these bad things with developing countries. But what are the good things? What is the advantages? And that's what I decided to write about.
And actually, there's a great video we're going to show to you right now, guys, that Fredrik made about this particular concept, about developing countries and developed countries, and what are the advantages of being in developing countries. So we get back to you in a minute.
You are the developed world. I am the developing world. You think that most things have been developed. I look for new opportunities. You look to your own part of the world for good ideas. I look everywhere for the best ideas. You know all about your world. I know all about my world and yours. You are stuck in the old infrastructure. I absorb and adopt the latest technology. You teach, I learn. You try to protect what you've got. I am determined to get what is mine. Your dream for tomorrow is to keep the status quo. I am dreaming great dreams and making them come true. Change makes you uncomfortable. For me, it is as natural as breathing. You are used to being in the lead. You take it for granted. You think that this gives you an advantage. And you say it will take us 100 years to catch up. I know better. You live in the developed world. I live in the developing world. You don't know where you're headed. I'm already embracing my dreams. Join me. Leave the developed world. Become part of the developing world.
And that was the video that we showed you about the countries. So Fredrik, now for you personally, when you did all this work to do research and develop for this book, You said you learned a lot of those new things about developing countries.
Yeah.
And what was your maybe favorite you could resonate the most with?
Well, people ask me a lot of time. First of all, I live in Singapore now, and people say, well, Singapore is not a developing country, but Singapore is actually the only country in the world where the people who live in the country don't know if Singapore is developed or developing, because it's both.
And it's both.
It's
both.
Right?
Both.
Yeah. So if you ask an audience of 100 people, 50% of Singaporeans will say developed, and 50% will say developing. So, and to me, Singapore is very much a developing country in the sense that I mean. The sense of it's always developing itself. Actually, Singapore has something called the Singapore Redevelopment Board, because they're redeveloping their country constantly, right? So they're never done. We're constantly redeveloping it. And that's the reason, that's the mindset that I like. When people ask, why do you live in Asia? Why do you live in Singapore? And the number one answer for me is the energy. Because the energy of not being done, not being finished, right? Like there's still things to do. Or the reverse, which is the developed world, which is like we're number one, so why try harder mentality. And a lot of the things going on in the West right now is like trying to go back to how it was, right? We used to, the most depressing thing is this. When you go back, if you ask people in the West, do you think your kids will have a better life than you do, right? The astoundingly big difference between different countries, but a large majority of people will say, no, I don't think my kids' life will be better than mine. And for me, that is like the ultimate test of if a country.
Well, you're father of 3 children, right?
Yes,
so
of course I want.
Of course, you want them to have a better life.
Of course, I want every parent wants their kids' life to be better. And if you don't believe that your country is going to be better tomorrow than it is today, you have lost hope. And if you don't have hope, you don't have vision, you don't have dreams, the future will not improve. And people think, they say, oh, it's because the developed world has debt or things like that. But it's not true, because the country where the most people say, the least number of people think that their kids will be better tomorrow is Norway. And Norway, so 90% of Norwegians, when I ask them, say, I don't think our kids will have a better life. But Norway is peaceful. It has a lot of oil. It has a lot of money in the bank. It has no national debt. If Norway was a person, we would say this person has everything going for it. It's well-educated, it's rich, it's healthy, it's everything. So
it's very pessimistic about the future. So
because they say we have it so good now, how could we possibly get it better? It's like we think that like development is kind of a roof, and now we have almost reached the roof. But if you look back in human development, like thousands of years back, they always thought they were almost close to reaching the peak, and then we developed again, right? So I'm not saying that the developed world stopped innovating. I am saying that the developed world could develop so much more if we had the mentality that we could do things so much better. So just because the developing world is now catching up, it's a stupid analogy. It's like, oh, people in China are becoming richer, so therefore we are losers, right? There's no logic behind that. It's the other way around. If China is developing, then America or Germany can also develop even more. So it's this mindset. It's only a mindset saying how could we possibly get better than this? Right?
And I guess maybe because for the developed world, the sort of the power in the world has been shifted long time ago, and it has been stable. Like countries that are developed, they have been developed now for a while, so they get used to that. They
get used to taking it for granted that they are developing, but they're not. A great example is airports. You fly a lot, I fly a lot, right?
Yes.
And if you go to America and you use an airport in America, almost all of the airports in America are terrible. Same with airlines. Like America doesn't have any of the airlines. It's like in the top. All the top airlines are now in Asia or in the Middle East, right? So airports like Charles de Gaulle, Heathrow, JFK, those used to be great airports 20, 30 years ago, right? Then when the developed world was like the leaders of innovation. But then those airports kind of like stagnated, and now they are some of the worst airports in the world, but we still in our head think they are great airports, right? Then you go to countries like India or China, even Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka it's a terrible history. There's been a war, they're poor, but they went from having a terrible, shitty airport to now having a really still small, but very well-functioning airport. So how could Sri Lanka surpass America in the quality of the airlines? How can America, in 10 years, make it a worse experience to fly instead of a better experience to fly. It's not that they couldn't develop airports further than what they did with JFK. It's that they mentally thought that they were done. Now Singapore is a good example because Singapore is the best airport in the world.
Yes.
Yes. And it has been for 25 years in a row, more or less always in the top. Because Changi never settles, they're never developed. They're always constantly saying, how can we make sure that our airport is the best in the world? And I actually interviewed Changi Airport and I said, how can you constantly be the best? And say, we always benchmark. When we built Changi 25 years ago, we went to all the best airports in the world and we looked, which are like, we went to JFK, went to Schiphol, and we took the best things that we saw. And then we incorporated that and we built Changi. Then I asked them, when is the last time Schiphol went and visited you? And they couldn't even remember. So Schiphol mentally said, like, and that's the mentality, right? That the people in the developing world, they will go look anywhere for the best ideas and take the best ideas that they can find. But the developed world only looks at what's happening in the developed world because they don't think there's anything they can learn from a country like China or Singapore or India.
You know, so then the interesting question is for people, let's say, who live in developed world these days, how do you actually change the mindset? You know, if
in the developed world.
Yes, if you grew up there and you have this mentality that you made it.
Yeah.
Right. So how do you actually change this mindset when you have those kids from China, India, Russia, you know, Latin America, who having the same education, catching up, and they are launching businesses?
Yeah, and I think the problem is not that the developed world now has this "we made it" mentality. That it's the problem is that they don't have the dreams and the visions anymore. They don't see how they could go further. And I think the best way to do that for someone in the developed world is to let go of whatever mindset they have where they live and start looking at look at what everyone else is doing basically, and travel more, look at websites that are not in the developed world, but because creativity, I know that's my theme, right? I'm the creativity guy. Creativity is to take my standard definition. You take two things and you combine it. And the more knowledge you have about the more different things you have knowledge about, the more things you can create, right? So for example, if you only know Italian food, you can only do Italian food. If you only know Indian food, you can only do Indian food. But if you know Italian food and Indian food, you can combine the two, which is a tandoori pizza, right? Which is a wonderful new idea of making a pizza. But you can only do that if you know both these worlds. And a lot of people in the West, they don't know anything about Asia or Africa or South America. It's like a blind spot, because that blind spot covers 60% of the world, 80% of the world population and probably 90% of the world surface. So we have a huge blind spot in the West and we're not looking because the people in the West think nothing is going on in Asia, or in developing countries, which used to be true, but it's not true anymore. It doesn't matter if we talk mobile advertising or social media use or latest drone technology, whatever it is. Now things are being developed equally around the world, not only in the developing world, but in the developing world and in the developed world. And as a curious, creative person, you need to look at what everyone is doing right now.
So the best way to actually level up your creativity is to travel, to try different things, preferably not from your culture.
Yes.
Right? So to talk to different people and see how they do this, and then find a way how you can combine it all together. And it's the most important also what you said is to just stay really hungry, and no matter how successful and established you are, that you always need to have this skill almost to dream bigger and have a bigger picture.
Yeah, I was actually just asked, because I'm doing a speech in Turkey, I think 2 months from now, and they asked me to define success. So what is your definition of success? So I just wrote that this morning. So what's your definition? So my definition of success is when everyone else thinks that you have made it, but you just think you're getting started. And the second part is the important one, because if you also think that you've made it, you're not successful. I mean, you might be successful at this moment, but you're not going to be successful, in the long run, because you're stagnated. You think you're done. It's like if you think you reached it's the rabbit and the hare. If you think that you're going to win, if you think you reach the finish line, or this bike races when the first guy thinks he's made it and he lets go of the bar and he gets all cocky and then he falls down. That's the thing. It's very dangerous to think that you reach the finish line. So that's the second part of the but you are just getting started. That's success.
Thank you so much, Fredrik. And that was Fredrik with us today talking about creativity and the developing world. And as you can see, it is actually very, very important to always stay creative. And I wish you guys to never settle and to always think that you are just starting. And if you love this video, what we hope you do share it with friends. And we're gonna talk to you next week.
For the parents, I think, and I look at what my parents did. For the parents, it's about giving your children the space to create something new and believing in their ability and believing in what you have given them, the value set you've given them, believing that will get them through. And realizing that culture can change. And this is important. Culture is not a static thing. It's not something that's unchanging. We don't, Sudanese culture is not the same 500 years ago as it is today. So giving ourselves the room to realize culture can change. And we are the people that change culture. And our children are going to be the people, your children are going to be the people that change culture.